First, we're going to talk about what does it mean when you have rent stabilization. It basically, I'm on page 4. It basically means 3 general things. Number 1, a rent stabilized tenant really can't be evicted. They can be evicted for cause, but it has to be very good cause. It's very hard to evict a rent stabilized tenant. Number 2, it means that the rent is depressed artificially. The rent can only go up by certain percentages that are promulgated by the Rent Guidelines Board. And number 3, rent stabilized tenancies come along with a tremendous amount of paperwork. There's an 11-page rider that you have to put on a rent stabilized lease. You have to register annually with the DHCR. Lots of stuff like that. Rent stabilized tenancies, I should also say, they last a long time. They can often be handed down within a family. Children of rent stabilized tenants will have succession rights. So when a building has rent stabilized tenants in it, it changes the character of that asset versus a free market building of the same size. All right, now, here's the first question you're probably going to ask me. Everybody asks me this. They call up and they say, Michelle, where's the list? And I'm like, what list? And they're like, the list of rent stabilized apartments. I need the list. I want to know if this apartment is on the list. Where's the list of what's rent stabilized and what's not rent stabilized? There is no list. There's no list. I mean, there's really no list. There is no one place that you can look to definitively get the answer unless a court or the DHCR, which has concurrent jurisdiction with the court, the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal, which oversees rent stabilization, unless DHCR or a court has made a decision on the matter, unless and until that happens, there's always some level of ambiguity about whether or not an apartment should be in rent stabilization. Stick with me, just stick with me. All right. I also want to say this as to why it's hard. The rent stabilization law goes back to 1974. So you have 40 plus years on the statute. Also, as I told you in session 1, there's 1,047 new housing court cases filed every day that the court is open in New York City. So there's a tremendous amount of jurisprudence working its way through the court system. We have 2 appellate terms controlling New York City and 2 appellate divisions. And we have the DHCR. So there's a ton of law, there's a ton of stuff happening, and it makes this network of decisions and statutes and regulations that there's just a lot to know. I also want to say as a threshold matter that a landlord and a tenant may not contract either in or out of the rent stabilization law. You can't do that. 2 parties could agree. A tenant could say, you know what, in exchange for the settlement of this matter, I agree the apartment is not rent stabilized. That stipulation isn't worth the paper it's written on. That doesn't bind anybody else. Interestingly enough, it doesn't even bind that tenant if they wanted to get out of it, no matter what consideration they got for it, because rent stabilization, understand, it's a status. It's a status based on objective criteria. It's not a thing to be bargained with by the parties.